across all our regional airports, but our focus is on working hard to ensure we get the right result.
Kerry McCarthy.
Thank you. I entirely accept the importance of regional airports to jobs. Obviously, Bristol Airport's on my doorstep, and I was director of London Luton Airport in my days as a councillor there. But I think that the fact the Minister can come and make a statement to the House or answer an urgent question about domestic flights without mentioning decarbonisation and climate change once just shows, well, he has in response to questions, but not in his initial response. He has to be prompted to do that. It is not enough to kick it into the long grass and say this is something we're going to deal with in the future. The Minister, it needs to be factored into his response to the Flybe emergency and APD now.
Well, I mentioned it at least 3 times, and I am trying to obey Mr. Speaker's instructions to keep my initial opening statement brief. I entirely recognise the importance of this. A significant amount of work is occurring within the department between 2 ministers, and I ask you to wait and see the documents when they are produced.
Gary Sambrook.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Last year, 30% of all flights in Birmingham Airport were operated by Flybe, and there'll be a lot of employees of both the airline and the airport who will be very worried about this current situation. Would the Minister reassure me and my constituents that he's doing everything practically possible that the government can do in talks with Flybe to protect jobs?
Once again, I recognise the importance of Flybe to Birmingham Airport as well. It's one of our key national airports, in my view. The government is working hard, as I keep reiterating, so we are certainly doing our best.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. If we are serious about tackling our carbon emissions, we must ensure that rail is an attractive and viable alternative to air travel, domestically certainly. But in places where this is not possible, the Isle of Man for obvious reasons, we must ensure that these domestic flights in the UK are green and sustainable. For example, using sustainable alternatives to kerosene and indeed looking at electric low-carbon planes as have been trialled in Orkney and Shetland. What has the Minister done specifically to ensure that UK domestic flights are as friendly as possible to the environment?
Well, as I said earlier, my own friend is working on looking at both alternative fuel sources and alternative power sources. She pointed out the example in Orkney. That's what we're working on for our transport decarbonisation plan that will be coming forth shortly.
Because
thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Minister's comments about the impact on smaller regional airports such as Humberside, based in my Cleethorpes constituency. And it's already been drawn to his attention the impact particularly on the offshore industries and the links to Aberdeen. Will he also take into account the fact that Flybe work in partnership with other airlines such as Eastern Airways, based in Humberside, and the impact it could have and the knock-on effect?
He is tempting me to go into a great lengthy answer about franchising arrangements with Flybe, which I am trying not to do so, but I very much hear his point, and I am wading into the detail of that on a regular basis.
Mike Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister went to school a stone's throw away from Manchester Airport in my constituency, but is the voice of Northern England being heard? After the debacle of Thomas Cook, 2.8 million passengers taken out of capacity. Flybe, 1.8 million passengers out of Manchester Airport if this collapse happens. I know people are worried about climate change, but APD was a tax devised by London civil servants in Whitehall cooling towers that crippled the growth of regional airports across our country, and we are paying the price for that.
Well, he's always a good defender of Manchester Airport, and I will grant him that. As you will know, ACL determines slot allocation at Manchester. The Thomas Cook slots have already been reallocated to both EasyJet and Jet2. ACL have the matter in hand, and I recognise the interest of Manchester in that process.
Stephen McParland.
Mr. Speaker, regional connectivity is at the heart of this government agenda, and the impact on Flybe collapsing and its partnerships with other airlines would be quite severe. Can the Minister confirm, or would he provide reassurance that they would support Flybe until the airline insolvency legislation has come into force?
We're certainly continuing to work hard to give all the support we can within government at this stage. I can't comment further on exactly what is occurring, but I very much hear his plea.
Alex Cunningham.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Teesside International Airport tripled its losses to nearly £6 million under the stewardship of the Tees Valley Mayor last year, after he paid tens of millions of pounds of taxpayers' money for it. Flybe is one of the few airlines providing flights from there, 44% of them, and is critical to the airport's future and the Mayor's plans. The government failed to intervene when SSI went bust. It refused to provide Sirius with a loan guarantee to unlock international investment. Is doing nothing to support Hitachi, who are making 250 people redundant. Is the government really prepared to continue failing the Tees Valley and see Flybe collapse, taking regional airports like Teesside with it?
I'm afraid you won't be surprised to hear I have great confidence in Mayor Houchin's stewardship of both. I'm afraid I'm not going to get stuck into he knows elections are coming, I know elections are coming, I know what he's up to.
Mr Speaker, Flybe fly from Leeds Bradford Airport in West Yorkshire to the likes of Newquay, Southampton and Belfast. Passengers there have very little alternative until we have major investment in regional and cross-country rail investment. So until then, does the Minister agree we need to keep investing in our regional infrastructure, and we also need to crack on with Trans-Pennine Rail?
He makes an incredibly important point that considering aviation is not just about aviation, it's also about our links across other modes. He will now hand the Minister for Northern Powerhouse Rail, take a very close interest in it, always happy to discuss it with him.
Jonathan Edwards.
Very well, Mr Speaker. Further to the question of my honourable friend for Cardiff South and Penarth, has the British Government received any direct representations from the Welsh Government following the news this morning?
Where have any representations received?
Cat Smith.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Following the debacles with Monarch and Thomas Cook, what lessons has the Minister learnt and will he be applying to the situation with Flybe?
Minister.
Well, I would caution that the various cases are not as similar as some might think. I'm not going to offer the running commentary, but the Department works very hard in collaboration with the CAA to monitor all airlines that operate out of this country.
Yeah. Bill Lesterson.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Of course the government should intervene to safeguard people's livelihoods and the economy around the country. But on the day where we hear about yet another increase in global ocean temperatures, when we know that parts of Australia are burning to a crisp, and when the government is on target for 2099 to hit net zero, not the 2050 it needs to, how can it be right that a subsidy which supports already profitable, successful airlines will encourage an increase in air travel and not see the reductions that are essential if we are to address our commitments to reducing the effects of climate change?
Minister.
Well, I think you may have heard my answers already, but let me try them again. I'm working hard with my honourable friend to make the UK a global leader in reducing aviation emissions, and you ought to wait and see our proposals when they come forward.
Last but certainly not least, the one and only Jim Shamp.
Mr Speaker, the Bible says that the last shall be first, the first shall be last. I'm very happy to be... absolutely, thank you so much. Can I thank the Minister for his response? Minister, you'll know that the success of Belfast City George Best Airport has been down to the government policy of connectivity and how important that is, but it's also been down to the success of Flybe. The Minister will probably be aware that Flybe fly from Belfast to 14 destinations in the United Kingdom, the largest of any other airline company. Some 3,400 jobs are dependent upon Flybe across the United Kingdom, but 150 of those jobs are important to Northern Ireland. So can I ask the Minister, in light of the new dawn we have in Northern Ireland, the Assembly's up and running, responsibility falls upon their shoulders. Has the Minister had the opportunity to speak to anyone in the Assembly, the First Minister for instance, to ensure that Flybe retains a position, important position, critical position for Northern Ireland?
Naturally, I welcome the resumption of Stormont. I note the fact that 68% of passengers at Belfast City are Flybe passengers, so it's clearly very important there. I'm in close contact with both the Northern Ireland office and the devolved administration over there.
We now come to the statement, Foreign Secretary.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And with your permission, I would like to make a statement on the Iran nuclear agreement known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Mr Speaker, I addressed the House yesterday on the wider concerns in relation to Iran's conduct in the region. The strategic aim for the UK and our international partners remains as it has always been: to de-escalate tensions, to hold Iran to account for its nefarious activities, and to keep the diplomatic door open for the regime to negotiate a peaceful way forwards. And Iran's destabilising activities should serve as a reminder to all of us of the danger to the region and to the world if Iran were ever to acquire a nuclear weapon. We cannot let that happen. And with that in mind, today the E3, consisting of the United Kingdom, France and Germany, have jointly taken action to hold Iran to account for its systematic non-compliance with the JCPOA. As the European parties to the deal, we have written to the EU High Representative Josep Borrell in his capacity as coordinator of the JCPOA. And we have formally triggered the dispute resolution mechanism, thereby referring Iran to the Joint Commission. Mr. Speaker, let me set out the pattern of non-compliance by the regime that left us with no credible alternative. Since last May, Iran has step by step reduced its compliance with critical elements of the JCPOA, leaving it a shell of an agreement. On the 1st of July 2019, the IAEA reported that Iran had exceeded key limits on low enriched uranium stockpile limits. On 8th of July, the IAEA reported that Iran had exceeded its 3.6% enriched uranium production limit. On the 5th of November, the IAEA confirmed that Iran had crossed its advanced centrifuge research and development limits. And then on the 7th of November, the IAEA confirmed that Iran had also restarted enrichment activities at the Fordo facility, a clear violation of JCPOA restrictions. On the 18th of November, the IAEA reported that Iran had exceeded its heavy water limits. And on the 5th of January of this year, Iran announced that it would no longer adhere to JCPOA limits on centrifuge numbers. Each of these actions were individually serious. Together, they now raise acute concerns around Iran's nuclear ambitions. Iran's breakout time, the time it would need to produce enough fissile material for a nuclear weapon, is now falling, a matter of international concern. Time and time again, we have expressed our serious concerns to Iran and urged it to come back into compliance. Time and time again, in its statements, and more importantly through its actions, it has refused, undermining the very integrity of the deal and flouting its international commitments. Iran's announcement on the 5th of January made clear that it was now effectively refusing to comply with any of the outstanding substantive restrictions the JCPOA had placed on its nuclear programme. Just to be clear, on that date, the Iranian government stated, and I quote, that its nuclear programme no longer faces any operational restrictions, including enrichment capacity, percentage of enrichment, amount of enriched material, and research and development. So, Mr. Speaker, it's with regret that the E3 was left with no choice but to refer Iran to the JCPOA's dispute resolution mechanism. The DRM is the procedure set out in the deal to resolve disputes between the parties to the agreement. And alongside our partners, we will use this to press Iran to come back into full compliance with its commitments and honour an agreement that is in all of our interests. The European External Action Service will now coordinate and convene the DRM process, and as a first step, it will call a meeting of the Joint Commission, bringing together all the parties to the JCPOA within 15 days. This process has been explicitly designed to allow participants flexibility and full control at each and every stage. So let me be clear to the House. We are triggering the DRM because Iran has undermined the objective and the purpose of the JCPOA, but we do so with a view to bringing Iran back into full compliance. We are triggering the DRM to reinforce the diplomatic track, not to abandon it. For our part, as the United Kingdom, we were disappointed that the US withdrew from the JCPOA in May 2018, and we have worked tirelessly with our international partners to preserve the agreement. We have upheld our commitments, lifting economic and financial sanctions on sectors such as banking, oil, shipping and metals. We lifted an asset freeze and travel bans on listed entities and individuals. We have sought to support a legitimate trade relationship with Iran. The UK, France and Germany will remain committed to the deal, and we will approach the DRM in good faith, striving to resolve the dispute and bring Iran back into full compliance with its JCPOA obligations. And as I made clear to the House yesterday, the government in Iran has a choice. The regime can take the steps to de-escalate tensions and adhere to the basic rules of international law, or sink deeper and deeper into political and economic isolation. So too, Iran's response to the DRM will be a crucial test of its intentions and its goodwill. We urge Iran to work with us to save the deal. We urge Iran to see this as an opportunity to reassure the world that its nuclear intentions are exclusively peaceful. And we urge the Iranian government to choose an alternative path and engage in the diplomacy and the negotiation to resolve the full range of its activities that flout international law and destabilise the region. And I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Foreign Secretary Emily Thornbley.
Mr. Speaker, and can I thank the Foreign Secretary for advance sight of his statement. For all of us who regard the Iranian nuclear deal as one of the crowning diplomatic achievements of this century and a path towards progress with Iran on other issues of concern, it is deeply distressing to see Iran join the United States in openly flouting its terms, as the Foreign Secretary has described. So I firmly agree with the action that has been taken today alongside our European partners. I also welcome every word of the earlier joint statement issued at the weekend by Britain, France and Germany in relation to the JCPOA. And I agree with their commitment to uphold the nuclear non-proliferation regime. I agree with their determination to ensure that Iran never develops a nuclear weapon. I agree with their conclusion that the JCPOA plays a key role in those objectives. I have been stronger in my wording, but I agree with their regret and concern. I would have said revulsion and condemnation over the Trump's administration's sabotage of the JCPOA and its reimposition of sanctions on Iran. I agree with their attempts to preserve the agreement despite the actions of Donald Trump and the reciprocal actions of the Iranian regime to which the Foreign Secretary referred in his statement. And I agree that Iran must be obliged to return to full compliance with its side of the agreement. That was a sensible and balanced statement on the JCPOA, stressing the international unity around the importance of retaining and restoring it, and accepting that both sides have breached it in terms and that neither has any justification for doing so. Which is what makes it all the more remarkable that this morning we heard from one of the signatories to that statement, our very own Prime Minister, telling BBC Breakfast the following, and I quote, "The problem with the JCPOA is basically, this is the crucial thing, this is why there is tension. From the American perspective, it is a flawed agreement, it expires, plus it was negotiated by President Obama." And the Prime Minister continued, "From their point of view, it has many, many faults. Well, if we're going to get rid of it, let's replace it with the Trump deal." And he concluded by saying, "President Trump is a great deal maker. By his own account and many others, let's work together to replace the JCPOA and get the Trump deal instead. That's what we need to see. That would be a great way forward." So, in the space of 2 or 3 days, the Prime Minister has gone from signing a joint statement with France and Germany, calling for the retention and restoration of the JCPOA, to calling for it to be scrapped and replaced by some mythical Trump deal. Now, the Foreign Secretary did not refer to any of that in his statement, and we could be forgiven for thinking that he and the Prime Minister are not exactly on the same page. But perhaps in his response, he could answer some questions about the Prime Minister's remarks. First, can he confirm that in his discussions with his American counterparts, that they have said that one of the problems with the JCPOA was that, to quote the Prime Minister, it was negotiated by President Obama? I mean, we all suspect that is Trump the toddler's main issue with it, but can he confirm the Prime Minister was correct? Second, can the Foreign Secretary tell us how this supposed alternative Trump deal, which the Prime Minister is so enthusiastic about, differs from the current JCPOA? Or, like his mythical Middle Eastern peace plan and his mythical deal with the North Koreans on nuclear weapons, it is simply another Trump fantasy? Third, can the Foreign Secretary tell us why on earth would Iran accept a new deal negotiated with Donald Trump with new conditions attached when he has shown his readiness to tear up the existing deal and move the goalposts in terms of what it should cover? And finally, Mr. Speaker, based on what the Prime Minister said this morning, are we now to understand that despite everything that the Foreign Secretary has said in his statement just now, and everything contained in the joint statement at the weekend, it is now official policy of the UK government to replace the JCPOA and get a Trump deal instead, and that would represent a great way forward? And if that is not official government policy, why did the Prime Minister say it? And why is he walking all over the Foreign Secretary's patch?
Can I thank, first of all, the Honourable Lady for her support for the action we've taken today, and indeed the action that we are taking as part of the E3. She made a number of points which, at the outset of her remarks, which I think were valid in relation to both holding Iran to account for the technical failures, but also the importance that we certainly attach to having a diplomatic door left ajar for Iran to come back from its non-compliance into compliance and live up to its responsibilities. She made a whole range of comments about the Prime Minister, which let me just address. First of all, it is Iran that is threatening the JCPOA with its systematic non-compliance. The Prime Minister fully supports the JCPOA and bringing Iran back into full compliance. That is the clear position. He said it on many occasions. And the Honourable Lady, draw a breath, allow me to respond to her remarks. She then made a whole series of attacks, as usual, on the US administration, which seemed to rather cloud her judgment in this area. In fact, it's not just President Trump, but also President Macron, who have argued for a broader deal with Iran, which first of all addresses some of the defects in the JCPOA, which is not a perfect deal, but is, in our view, the best deal we've got on the table as of now. And secondly, would address the wider concerns that the US and many other states, including the United Kingdom, have about Iran's broader destabilising activities in the region. The US and our European partners want us to be ambitious in our diplomatic approach with Iran, and that is something that I fully subscribe to. I fear the Honourable Lady is rather confusing her attacks on the US administration with a sober and sensible policy making in this area. We believe as of now, Prime Minister, the whole government, that the JCPOA is the best available deal for restraining Iran's nuclear ambitions. And we want Iran to come back into full compliance. Equally, as was discussed in Biarritz last year, the Prime Minister, the United States and our European partners are fully open to a broader initiative which would address not just the nuclear concerns, but the broader concerns around the destabilising activity that we've seen recently, in particular in relation to the Quds Force. The choice of the regime in Iran as of today is very simple. It can take the diplomatic path. It can come back into full compliance with the JCPOA and thereby give this country, our European partners and our American partners, and crucially many of the partners in the region, the reassurance around its nuclear ambitions. And if it wants to, it can also take the diplomatic path to resolve all of the outstanding concerns that the international community have about its conduct. This is the choice for the regime in Iran. If they're willing, in good faith, to take that path, we will be ready to meet it with British diplomacy.
Jeremy Hunt.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the Foreign Secretary for his support for the Iran nuclear deal, because the simple truth is that if Philip Hammond had not negotiated that, Iran would have nuclear weapons today and the Middle East would be immensely more dangerous. But it has caused a lot of stresses in the Western alliance, and I'd like to ask for his view as to the best way to strengthen that alliance, because however tattered and strained it is a vital foundation for our peace and prosperity, and has been for the last 70 years.
Well, I thank my right honourable friend, and he of course knows a lot of the recent history of this as well, if not better than I do. The answer is, I think, as always, for Britain to exercise its judgment and the full energy of its diplomacy to make sure we forge common purpose with our European and our American friends. I was in the US and Brussels over the last 2 weeks, and we'll continue that endeavour. And I think the worst thing that we should do right now is try and allow or foment divisions in that partnership, because that only encourages the hardliners in Tehran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I commend the Foreign Secretary on his statement, and I have to say I agreed with every word of it. We on these benches very much support actions against nuclear proliferation in the Middle East. There was ample scope to trigger the DRM. I'm glad the External Action Service is going through the gears on that. And I very liked his phrase to the efforts here are to reinforce the diplomatic track. We all agree on that. So let's go back to this morning's interview from the Prime Minister, where he said, and I think it bears repetition, on Breakfast TV this morning he said, let's replace it, the JCPOA, with the Trump deal. That's what we need to see. President Trump is a great deal maker by his own account and by many others. Let's work together to replace the JCPOA and get the Trump deal instead. Foreign Secretary, I'm very happy to support you from these benches, but it seems you're getting more support from the SNP than your own Prime Minister. How seriously do you think Tehran takes us all right now?
Well, I think we engage with the regime on the basis that I've set out, that they have a choice. Can I thank him for his support? This isn't something about the UK position. It's not something about any nuance between the Prime Minister. This is actually the position of the E3 at leader level, which has made clear in its joint statement recently that we would like to preserve the JCPOA, but we are also ambitious for a broader rapprochement with Iran, which of course would have to take into account all the other areas of international concern. It is not just the nuclear issue that is a concern to us. It is the destabilising activity. It is the downing of the Ukrainian airline flight. It is the treatment of our dual nationals. And so even if we got Iran back to the JCPOA in full compliance, those issues would remain. And of course we should, with our American partners, and as we're doing with our European partners, look to deal with all of those issues for the long term.
Richard Drax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wonder if anyone believes that the current regime is ever going to adhere to the JCPOA. Can I ask my right honourable friend what the biggest threat now? Could it be that Israel, who has been threatened by Iran, is likely to strike if this goes on, unless some sort of agreement is reached, which of course could inflame an already very difficult situation?
Well, can I thank the honourable gentleman and just say this? It's not clear to me that there is any credible alternative to a diplomatic route to solving this issue long term, even airstrikes, and I won't get into all the operational matters. The only way of dealing with the concerns that we have is a mixture, a combination of holding Iran to account when it behaves badly, and it has systematically in relation to its nuclear ambitions, but also leaving the door of diplomatic opportunity and the door to diplomacy open. That's the position of the UK, and I believe actually that is also the position of not just our European partners, but our American partners too.
Chris Brown.
I certainly don't want to defend the actions of the Iranian regime on any account. But the Foreign Secretary was instrumental when he was on the backbenches in making sure that the government introduced legislation known as the Magnitsky Amendments, which were to enable the government to have another tool in the box in relation to sanctions. They were primarily considered as relating to Russia, but would it not be a good idea to have these on the statute book now in the UK as fast as possible? And would we not be considering using those sanctions in relation to Iranians as well?
Can I thank the honourable gentleman? He's quite right, first of all, about the importance of having that sanctions capacity, and as we leave the EU, we'll have more autonomy to do that. It is something that we're looking forward to bringing forward. It was mentioned in the Queen's speech. He's also made the point, and I think we've always agreed about this since the campaign for Magnitsky, a Magnitsky regime in this country, that it certainly shouldn't just apply to Russia or one or other country, but should be universal in geographic scope, and the approach that we are taking will be.
Christian Wakeford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year, an archive of documents relating to Iran's nuclear programme was unearthed in a Tehran warehouse by Israel's intelligence agencies. The documents reveal the extent of Iran's deception to the IAEA and the world powers about its historic work to develop nuclear weapons and its ongoing efforts to circumvent the JCPOA. So is my right honourable friend able to confirm whether the UK has seen these documents and whether he shares Israel's concerns about their contents?
Thank the honourable gentleman. He makes some interesting points. I'm not going to comment on intelligence matters or operational matters. But what I can say is, of course, we share Israel's concern, not just about the nuclear ambitions that Iran has, but also about the wider activities in the region. The point that I think we with all of our partners agreed on, that ultimately this requires the regime in Tehran to give up those ambitions and negotiate a way out of economic and political isolation, which will only deepen, and actually live up to the responsibilities that it's got to its own people, because there is a better path for the people of Iran, but it's got to be a choice that is taken by the regime in Iran. Debbie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is a very troubling time, not only for Mr. Ashuri and his family, but for other relations of British nationals being held in Iranian prisons. Can the Foreign Secretary clearly outline what steps he intends to take to support these individuals and their families and prevent them from being exploited even further in this dreadful situation?
First of all, I entirely agree with her. The plight of the nationals and dual nationals in detention from our country and other countries around the world is at the forefront of our minds. And of course, we've seen the systematic and callous behaviour by Iran in relation to them increase over time, not decrease. So it is all part of a wider pattern of behaviour. We will do everything we can to secure their release, and whilst they are in detention, the best conceivable treatment that we can imagine. But again, as with these other issues, Iran has got to realise that it cannot pursue its appalling behaviour, whether it's on the nuclear front, whether it's destabilising countries in the region, or the treatment of dual nationals, without being held to account. And that's the policy of the UK.
Mark Harper. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the decision to trigger the dispute resolution mechanism, but I also think, given it, we've seen Iran over the last few weeks use ballistic missiles and use them to attack coalition forces, and in the wake of the killing of General Soleimani, we've had another reminder of all of the activities he used to carry out. I think it's sensible for the Prime Minister to have an ambition to bring the US back on board as part of this deal, but also to widen it to encompass all of the other activities of Iran. And can the Foreign Secretary perhaps set out what Britain might do to try and kickstart that process, as well as bringing the JCPOA back into full action?
Well, I think my right honourable friend is absolutely right. We want to preserve the JCPOA. That's the only current deal in town. But of course, we're ambitious to see a broader rapprochement. That's not just the Prime Minister's view, but he has been actively supporting President Trump and President Macron. And there's a huge amount of diplomatic work being undertaken by myself, by the Prime Minister, and others, and our international partners to achieve that. But we come back to the basic equation and the basic choice. That is ultimately a decision that must be made in Tehran. Because leaving the diplomatic door ajar is one thing, but Iran's got to be willing to walk through it. So we will make sure that that diplomatic route and that diplomatic path and a better alternative for Iran is there. But it must be something that the regime in Tehran, bearing in mind all the recent events and the growing economic isolation, the disaffection of many, many people in Iran with the state of affairs, it's got to be something the government chooses and pursues of its own volition.
Hilary Benn.
Much indeed, Mr. Speaker. It's precisely because we support this deal that the E3 were left with no option but to take the action they've done, and I support the government in doing so. But can I bring the Foreign Secretary back to the Prime Minister's remarks this morning? Because either the Prime Minister wants to maintain this deal, or he is now advocating for its replacement. He cannot credibly hold both positions. Which one is the policy of the government?
The right honourable gentleman is just wrong. Of course you can want to preserve this deal, but be ambitious if it's possible to bring in the United States and Tehran into a broader rapprochement, dealing not just with the nuclear issue, but the wider destabilising activities. And that's the policy that we're pursuing, and we're doing it with the US, but also, crucially, with our EU partners. And there seems to be a bit of amnesia on the benches opposite. It was President Macron who last year proposed a very similar approach. And just as we're willing to support that in relation to proposals that initiated from Washington, we also supported it in relation to Macron. We want to keep the transatlantic alliance together, and we want to bring a broader rapprochement between the US and Iran that can lead to a better path for the Iranian people.
Speaker,
it seems that the JCPOA in its current form is dying, although it's not dead yet, although I pay compliment to the Foreign Secretary and his ministers for the work that they are doing. Is there any common ground between the United States and Iran on a potential JCPOA 2?
Well, Well, I don't think that it's clear that there is as of now. But what there is, and the E3 statement backed this up, is scope. If Iran is willing, we come back to that basic dynamic and that basic choice. If Iran is willing to see some sort of broader deal that would address not just the nuclear front, but the wider destabilising activities. I think if we want a longer-term resolution to the challenge that Iran faces, that brings in the United States and all the relevant partners in the region, it's absolutely right that we hold to that ambition and we pursue it where we can.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And can I thank the Secretary of State for prior citing his statement. Given the Secretary of State's earlier remarks about dual nationals in Iran and the increasingly desperate situation of Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, I wonder if he could clarify for us when the Prime Minister is going to meet Richard Ratcliffe. At the moment, all we have is soon. Will this be taken up as a matter of urgency and a meeting arranged this week if possible?
The meetings that the Prime Minister has will be publicised in the usual way through the usual channels. But I've met with Richard Ratcliffe. We, of course, understand the concern of the family of Nazanin and also all the other dual nationals that are detained. We've seen Iran's behaviour deteriorate, not just on the nuclear front, not just in relation to the Revolutionary Guards activities in the region, but also in relation to dual nationals. And it is at the forefront of our mind to get a deal long-term with the Iranians that can bring in all of those aspects, which is why the nuclear deal is critically important, but we also want to address those wider issues, which is why the Prime Minister's taken the approach he has.
Robert Court.
Speaker, would the Foreign Secretary outline the steps that are being taken to safeguard British citizens, personnel and interests in the region?
I thank my honourable friend. We obviously keep the security of our armed forces under a constant review. We do the same in terms of shipping in the Gulf, and particularly the Strait of Hormuz. We've amended our travel advice. You will have seen that recently. Obviously, we make sure that we've got the appropriate level of safety and security arrangements around our embassy and our diplomatic personnel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Foreign Secretary is absolutely right to highlight the importance of diplomacy in resolving this crisis. Could he update us on the situation of the British ambassador to Iran, particularly given that in the last couple of hours, including in the Financial Times, it's been reported that Ghassan Halemi, who's a representative of the Iranian judiciary, has called for him to be persona non grata and expelled from the country. This is completely unacceptable, and would the Foreign Secretary agree?
Well, first of all, we've had no formal indication of that description. I think it would be deeply regrettable if that were the case. We need to keep the diplomatic channels open, and therefore futile gestures like that are not going to resolve the problems that the regime in Tehran face.
Mr. Speaker, could I welcome the Secretary of State's focus not just on the tactical issues, but the wider strategic context that we face. I repeat the point that I made yesterday in the urgent question. There's little incentive of Iran to support the JCPOA when economic reform can't take place. It couldn't take place before because of legacy sanctions connected with ballistic missiles prevented any bank with international ties to the United States from supporting any new trade. Will he make sure that a future deal deals with these legacy sanctions and also prevents the country on using any new funds, such as oil revenues or released frozen assets, from being spent on its proxy wars across the region?
Well, if I may say so, my honourable friend makes a good point, but he also, I think in his question, highlights a conundrum. On the one hand, we do not want to take or relieve the pressure on Iran in relation to its nefarious activities. On the other hand, we have to incentivise, to the extent that we can, the right path and the right kind of conduct which can build up the confidence of its international partners. At the moment, I think that it is very clear, both in relation to the JCPOA but more broadly, that that door is left open for Iran. What is missing is the political will and the good faith on behalf of the regime in Tehran.
Shannon. Mr. Deputy Speaker, and welcome to your place as well. The JCPOA, successful or not, will impact upon countries across the world. Iran is not a safe place for civilians, for their own people, never mind any other citizens. The shooting down of the jet would be an example of just that happening. So can the Minister outline his intention to prepare and secure expats and workers in Iran? And what advice would be given to people who are working there, British citizenship or indeed other citizenship across the world, to maybe get ready to leave Iran and leave Iran now?
thank the right honourable gentleman, and he's right, and we are always concerned to make sure we do the right thing, give honest and accurate and clear advice to British citizens wherever they are in the world. In relation to Iran, we have amended again our travel advice. You will have seen that, and so that is the normal way, and we would point both individuals and businesses to that for the appropriate guidance.
Mr.
Speaker, it's good to see you in your chair. On the question here arises not just, of course, for our European partners in the E3, but also for our partners in the region. Could the Foreign Secretary perhaps tell me a little bit about the conversations he's had with partners, and maybe even with our new partner, the new Sultan of Oman, on how we're dealing with Iran going forward?
Well, thank the honourable gentleman, and he's absolutely right. The Prime Minister was there for the funeral of the Sultan, and that was a valuable opportunity also to engage in conversations with the new Sultan. We've had conversations with our partners right around the region. There is a clear commonality of view that we need to de-escalate the tensions, but also hold Iran to account for its behaviour. I think the approach that we're taking in the context of the JCPOA, and bear in mind, of course, we have to look and engage very carefully with Russia and China around this as well, is that on the terms of the deal, clearly, plainly, squarely, Iran has, in its own words, effectively left the agreement as a shell. And the right thing to do, as envisaged by the agreement, is take matters to the dispute resolution mechanism and to use that to leverage and to bring some sense and some clarity to the regime in Tehran and to encourage them to come back to full compliance.
Jonathan Edwards.
Hello, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and it's great to see you back in your rightful place. The British government are right to work with our European partners and to work within the formal mechanisms of the nuclear deal. Can you inform the House what response has he received from China and Russia following the actions he has taken?
Well, we are engaging with them, and we'll engage with them more during the context and the process of the DRM. But we need to be clear, this isn't a transatlantic issue, it's not just an Iranian issue, it's a regional and a global issue, because the prospect of a nuclear-armed Iran would be damaging and devastating and destabilising for the region and the world. So this is something that all permanent members of the Security Council need to be engaged in and live up to their responsibilities to make sure, through the diplomatic track and through the pressure that on all sides we exert, that Iran cannot pursue those ambitions.
Philip Holloway.
Triggering the dispute resolution mechanism is a good thing, but to be frank, only doing so after 6 months of, to use the Foreign Secretary's own words, serious and systematic non-compliance is weak. The JCPOA is time-limited. It would never prevent Iran having a nuclear weapon. It would only delay the chances of that happening. But it can't do that if, to use the Foreign Secretary's own words, it's just a shell of an agreement. So what are the dangers of Iran reducing its breakout time whilst the dispute resolution mechanism is underway? And isn't it time for a truly comprehensive agreement covering both nuclear weapon technology, missile technology, and Iran's export of terror?
Can I thank the honourable gentleman, and I share his concerns that there are weaknesses to the JCPOA. It is time limited. There are other weaknesses to it. We've never been doe-eyed about it being the perfect deal, but it is also the only deal in town which is restraining the behaviour of Iran. And to the extent that we've now got to a situation where Iran is not complying with those restraints, we have to trigger the DRM as a matter of the credibility of the deal, as a matter of the credibility of us as the E3. But I take his point, and that's the point the Prime Minister made, that we should also be ambitious for a broader deal which deals not just with the nuclear issue in a more sustainable long-term way, but all of those other wider concerns people have and the region has and the Europeans and the Americans have about Iran's conduct in the region.
Andrew Bower.
Much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I thank the Foreign Secretary for a statement and welcome the action taken today. Can I ask if any discussions are being had with the multiple oil and gas companies that operate in the region who employ a large number of British citizens, many of whom are my constituents or family members of my constituents in West Aberdeenshire? There is obviously a concern in West Aberdeenshire and Kincardine of the safety of those who are out there working for oil and gas companies in what remains a very, very unpredictable situation.
Well, can I thank my honourable friend? I think the Defence Secretary set out the contingency planning in relation to military support for shipping in the Straits of Hormuz, which of course will affect the sector he's talking about. And we have, not just in relation to Iran, but more broadly in the countries of the region, adjusted and will keep under constant review our travel advice so that whether it's businesses or individuals travelling, they've got the clearest guidance about the risk.
Thank you, Secretary of State. Order. Order. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Queen's Speech, motion for an address, adjourned debate on question.
Now.
The question is that a humble address be presented to Her Majesty as on the order paper. Secretary of State.
Thank you, Will. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And before I go further, can I just say how delighted I am